Hi guys, welcome to Grow Up. Today we've got Lara Logan joining us, one of the most amazing journalists that we have had in the United States for so long now. I mean, it's rare to find somebody with her talent and her, just commitment to the truth. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, both of you.
So, the broad topic here is how are we going to overcome everything that the Republican Party is facing at this moment in time? We're at a stage in history that I think we're going to look back on and say that whatever happens next over these next few years was pivotal to where we end up 25 years from now. What do you see as the most dangerous sort of change that we're undergoing as a country right now?
Well, to me, it's pretty simple, right? Because if you look at it, principles are the same. They don't change. The Spartans fought for freedom. The founding fathers fought for freedom. People today are fighting for their freedom all over the world. And why is Shakespeare still relevant today? All of those things that endure over time, those lasting things really don't change. So they're not that hard to identify. And when you look at the threats to freedom, they're also not that hard to identify because they don't change that much either. But there is something that has changed where we're in uncharted waters, and that's really technology. We've never been in a phase where, yes, there's always been disinformation. There's always been propaganda. Governments have always lied. Politicians have always lied. But now we live in a world where those lies really, we live in a world without borders, because in the cyber world, in the digital world, there are no borders. Our laws apparently mean nothing because they haven't been enforced. No one's done anything to prevent the tech companies from amassing these vast monopolies that span the globe and give them extraordinary power. And not only that, but we react to things in the digital cyber world when we don't even know that they're real or not. And so that world already has an outsized influence over us in the real world. And some people pretty much live in the cyber world already. So that to me is the real, that's the thing that's really different, because it gives people a power that they've never had before. And what I see this as is really an old-fashioned fight between good and evil. For me, it's not about Democrat or Republican, because what you're facing is tyranny. That's what it is. It's tyranny in all forms. It's pretty easy to recognize. I mean, when you don't believe in freedom of speech anymore, when you start modifying that, when you deem your political rivals as domestic terrorists, I mean, wow, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see what that really represents. And it represents tyranny. And while there are many of the tactics of systems like Marxism and communism, that you can see, and if you are a student of history, you would be recognizing many of those tactics now. And there are many people in this country who would like to see a Marxist communist state here instead of the one that it has always existed since the founding of this country. I mean, to me, they're also tools of tyranny, because if you look at who is driving the money, who's funding the Marxists and the communists, who is funding technology, who is funding the political campaigns, there's a consistency there in these foundations and charitable organizations and 501(c)(3)s, and none of them are Marxist or communist in their outlook. What do they believe in? I mean, they tell you what they believe in: sustainable development, social justice for all across the world, one world, right? Where we own less than we've ever owned before, but we've never been happier. And if you think about it, why do we own less today? Well, because in the old days, if you ran out of money, you still had the records that you'd bought, right? And your record player, and you could play music. What happens now if your card is stolen or you're just out of cash? You can't access these services anymore. I mean, who remembers when Apple Music migrated to a subscription system? I don't know how many thousands of dollars I had spent for years building a music library that went poof, like that, it was gone. And with technology, we don't even know what we're buying anymore because the product changes at will for the technology companies. And now we're going to be tracked by our dishwashers and our fridges and our stoves and, our every appliance that we own, in addition to our televisions and our phones. And why does that matter? Because it is the greatest, most powerful system of social control that has ever existed. And if you go back to the origins of Marxism, Karl Marx was hired by Henry Rothschild to design a system of social control, socialism. And that's what he did. Well, now you have socialism, or whatever system of social control you can come up with, like Facebook, Twitter. These are collection platforms, right? That are collecting intelligence and information on every person on the planet. And now they're doing it through your messaging systems and your appliances and your music and where you shop, and has anyone even questioned, why does Google have a microphone and now a camera in Google Nest? What can they do with that microphone besides listen to your conversations? You know what they can do? They can use sonar technology to map out every room in your house. They know how big it is. They know how many rooms you have. And what else do they use? Patented sound technology to interpret the sounds that they hear in your house, not just the language and the content. So if you think about what does that information, everyone knows that knowledge is power, that data is the most valuable resource on the planet today, more valuable than, precious minerals, gold and platinum and everything else, even the rare minerals. Why is that? Because knowledge is so powerful. And what can you do with all that knowledge? Well, the technology companies, if you think about it, Microsoft operates secret government computer systems. Dell Computers builds those computers. So the heads of those companies know every secret in America.
And Amazon too.
And Amazon too. Why is Amazon tracking you when you're on Drudge? They're not in the business of political publications, or are they? What are they tracking you for? Because all of these technology companies know that ultimately the human brain and controlling the human mind is the ultimate goal. That's what's going to bring them the most engagement or the most, participation and buy-in into whatever it is that they create. And that is where the money lies. So control and money and tyranny, they go hand in hand.
Absolutely. How do we overcome this? What do you see as the possible roads out of this to ensure that we don't fall to tyranny?
Well, my specialty as a journalist, I really, I try first and foremost to understand. I have to learn enough that I can make a valuable contribution to for other people to understand. And it doesn't just mean, gaining a superficial understanding. It means really going down deep into the layers of it and figuring out not just what's accurate, but what's not misleading. And so what I've learned from people is that it's going to take a number of different practical things. Like, you have to enforce your laws, but the law isn't going to solve all of this because the law can't keep up with technology. Congress moves at the pace of molasses, right? If it moves at all. So, and technology is advancing rapidly. We're making decisions today about our privacy and, what we're willing to do based on how technology operates and functions now. But what is it going to look like 6 months from now or a year from now? Right? And we don't know. And so those decisions may look like, ones that look like very good decisions now may look like very bad decisions. So we know that we have to have systems that keep up with the pace of technology. Technology is now moving faster than the human brain and the human eye and everything human. 5G, you can alter reality literally in real time. So we don't know what's real anymore and what isn't. And so that then comes back to our faith in institutions and our faith in government and our faith in elections and everything else. And in order to protect those institutions, we have to stand up for principles and not parties and not personalities, because the principles are the only things that will survive. No matter what comes with technology, whether it's 1984 or the apocalypse or both of them combined, the only thing that will rise out of the ashes or endure all the way through are the principles. So that means encouraging people, your own children and your friends and whoever you work with, to really mean it when they say that they're going to stand up for what they believe in and who they are. And that doesn't mean standing for, one party over another or one system over another. It means standing up for those fundamental principles. You can also, as a matter of, things that are very practical, informing yourself obviously is critical. So there are apps out there like Ghostery is one that I've recently come to learn about, which actually shows you in real time who's tracking you when you're on a particular website. So I was surprised to learn that on my own, not mine, but the Fox News channel, for example, there were 22 apps that I'd never heard of tracking me when I was on there. And, that's replicated all across the news media and retail and everywhere else. So that's one of the things you can do, is figure that out. Then we have to hold our elected leaders accountable. Some people say to me that limited terms are critical because that's the only thing that's going to stop the stranglehold that big tech has over elected officials in this country. When money from big tech is getting people elected, as we've seen, right? The proof is in the pudding. They don't enforce antitrust legislation. They allow them to violate the First Amendment and to censor even when they have legal immunity against any kind of litigation for censorship and defamation and things like that, on the basis that they don't censor and that they're not a content moderator, they're just a publisher. Well, we know that's not true. What have they done about that? So if we don't hold Congress and our elected leaders accountable, and we don't put pressure on them to enforce the laws, and we don't create monitoring systems where you can find out in real time where technology can be created that keeps up with the technology of big tech and exposes what is happening. If you don't have those monitoring systems, then you don't have a chance. And if you don't have an honest means of getting that information out. Right now, one side of the political spectrum has total information dominance. And if we don't address that, then it's hard to see how you affect any of those changes. But at the end, what I will tell you is this: it comes down to the human spirit. And that spirit is truly the strongest thing of all. We can be broken for a moment, but we have the power within ourselves to stand up. So every time you feel, depressed or overwhelmed, I think the thing that I fall back on is knowing that the truth is the only thing that can be challenged. It's the only thing that stands up to questioning. Lies have no legs. You have to keep telling other lies and other lies and other lies to keep the lies going. And eventually people see through them. And people, no matter where they come from and no matter who they are, they really do want and prefer to know the truth. The ugly truth, the difficult truth, no matter what it is, they want the truth. And that's those instincts, those things that are true in us, knowing who you are, what you believe in and what you stand for, and being willing to stand for that even when it's costing you, is really, to me, what will endure through all of this.
Absolutely. There's so many good points that you made there with, just in the political context, fighting for legislation, holding big tech accountable, as well as all of these monopolistic facets of our culture. What I, am concerned about, as a mom and, having a family, raising a family, creating your own systems of people that you surround yourself to try to uphold those values. The education system, as we know it, in my opinion, is virtually unsalvageable at this point because of that monopolization of, the institutionalization model of education and what they've done with that. Essentially, they're rooting out what makes us human, like what you just spoke about, our character, our principles, all of these things now, they're maligning with white supremacy. How do we, what is the, guidance for parents who have their kids in these systems? They're trapped and they have nowhere to take them.
Well, I've never thought of it as unsalvageable. That's a very interesting point. And I'm definitely going to give that a lot more thought. Is it unsalvageable? Is anything ever unsalvageable? That's a very valid question. And I understand it because I'm a mom too. And I also have children in the school system. And I cannot imagine that schools are telling parents and children that they prefer them not to use the terms mom and dad, because I know that of everything I've ever done in my entire life, and I've been a journalist for so long, and I've really been, you know, able to be in some extraordinary moments, and with a team of incredible people, we've done work that we're very proud of, that we know has mattered, but none of it, nothing I've ever done work-wise means anything in comparison to what it has meant to me and to my children, for me to be the best mother that I can be. It dwarfs everything else. And nobody likes you to say that today, right? The message is only that you don't have to be stuck at home. You can have a career. And of course, I've had a career and I have one still. And it's very important to me. And I have loved every moment of it, even when it's been, you know, incredibly difficult and painful sometimes. But that is no substitute for what it means to be a mom. And I often tell young girls, you may be surprised when you're in those positions that you might not want the things that are so important to you now. And it's okay. Why do we have to put ourselves in a box? But we've really reached a stage where, in order for some people not to feel marginalized or disenfranchised or invalidated, or whatever the word is that you want to come up with, we have to be invalidated. A mother and a father, those things have to be invalidated so that those who don't have or don't like or don't feel comfortable with or don't agree with whatever it is, those traditional roles, don't have to be invalidated. And you know what? I would say that that is a load of nonsense. If I could use foul language right now, I would, because I have a bad habit of doing that. However, what I mean by that is, I know, you know, and plenty of gay couples who take those motherly and fatherly roles very, very seriously. You know, and who thinks that mothering is only defined by your gender? Of course it's not, right? And yet at the same time, there are very real things that define a mother and versus a father, and they're real. You can try to write them out of your language. You can try to indoctrinate them and brainwash them out of your children, and you may even succeed to a degree. But there's one thing that you will never do. You will never make them untrue, because that's how it is. It just is. You see it in animals. We're not the only species you see it in. So what I like to say all the time is, there's only one truth, because there really is only one truth. And people will say my truth, and you know, that just is just, you know, that's perception, and that's opinion, and that's experience, and that's how you feel about it. And all of that is valid, and you know, depends on all different circumstances, and is very personal, and that's your right. But it doesn't change the truth. And that to me is what saves all of us from ourselves, and saves all of us from the tyranny that we see around us. Because you can say that January 6th was an armed insurrection, and it's either true or it's not. Right? And you can say that anyone who voted for Trump is a domestic terrorist. It's either true or it's not. You can say that Donald Trump lied when he said his campaign was spied upon. Either true or it's not, you know? And so to me, the education system and the school system has to be, you have to fight for it. You can't just let it go. You can't just give up on it. If it's because it's so important. And it's worth fighting for. If it is worth fighting for, then stand up and fight. You know, it's easier to blame the guns and say it's not because of lack of opportunity. It's not because of, you know, rampant drug use across the streets and criminal, you know, activity. And yet, if you go into those neighborhoods and you speak to people there, the one thing they ask for is not to get rid of the Second Amendment. It's an opportunity. You know, it's, and so we look to the easy solutions all the time. We want to say, well, okay, school system is done. right? So, I mean, it's unsalvageable, and therefore we need to think of something else. And maybe that's right. I'm not, that's not my lane, right? I don't come up with systems. I don't, I don't run governments. I don't run departments. I couldn't even run my own company. So what I do is I am a storyteller and a journalist. And that's all I've ever wanted to be. It's what I was made to be. And that's what I know how to do. So my job is to figure out, I don't have to figure out who I am because I was lucky enough to be born knowing that. What I have to figure out is how close can I get and how much of the truth can I get? And lately, how much can I take in standing up for that? Because every one of us that stands up in some way, we know you're standing up for the good. And how do I know the good is worth it and the good is worth fighting for? Because I have it in me. And if you have it in you, then you know too, right? So don't abandon the good teachers. Don't abandon the teachers and the principals who are being drowned in these school systems where the impression is that everyone in academia thinks the same way. They're all in favor of safe spaces. I keep being reminded when I go to, say, for example, California, and I am expecting that everybody I meet is going to be looking at the world with one view and is going to hate Texas, where I'm from, and is going to be a hardcore Democrat and is going to love Newsom. And honestly, the first 5 people I speak to every time will remind me that that is not how the world works. And the people with the megaphone right now, they do not represent the majority of people in this country. And big tech, with their divisive algorithms that make money out of dividing us, they don't represent the true sentiment of people in this country.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and just to clarify, what I'm suggesting is we have to be creative about what we choose to salvage and what's not salvageable on an individual basis, and everybody has to decide that for themselves, because the nature of how some of these school systems are set up, it's done in such a way that parents can bang pots and pans all they want, but at the end of the day, their children are still being signed up for indoctrination.
Yes.
These curriculums, which they can't escape from. And one of the things that we were able to do with our children is all those teachers, those amazing teachers that you talk about, the good people that are standing up for truth, and they're pushing back against the system. They left that system, and we are building new systems, micro schooling, being creative and breaking out of this old paradigm, these boxes of how we think that we're supposed to be in to fight for something. We have to question at the end of the day what we're fighting for. Are we fighting for our values? And if they're not allowed to be maintained, we have to forge ahead in another direction, because that's the cost. They say the truth will set you free, but if you're limited your access to truth and information, how are children going to have that realization if they're not as privileged to have loving parents that are going to instill that sense of humanity in them? So that's a great point.
You're absolutely right about that. And you remind me of something that Dinesh D'Souza said to me once when we were talking about this in academia, in the colleges and in the schools, that there are certain things that when you grow up in that environment and you're only exposed to one view of the world and one way of looking at it, that there are certain things that become accepted truths. And I think that's one of the things that you're talking about, right? Is that how can the truth set you free if you're accepting certain things as absolute fact because you've never been exposed to anything else and you don't have any idea. And so, see, you're a visionary in a sense and have a strategic mind, in that you're looking at how to fix these things. I'm the one that is on the ground breaking down the doors, trying to figure it out, and show people what the real problems are and what the truth is, so that people like you can come up with those type of solutions. And so I would be very interested as a parent in the things that you're talking about. And my only concern would be if you further separate and divide the country by people with these views gravitate towards these micro schools and people with those views gravitate towards those other existing institutions, which doesn't mean at all that you don't seek alternatives. I think that you're 100% right. At the same time, why should our tax dollars pay to indoctrinate the children of this country and our own children? Why should our tax dollars pay for witch hunts in the military that are based on politics? Why should our tax dollars pay to put soldiers to prevent we the people from accessing the Congress, our own government? Why are we paying for school systems that teach children that the color of their skin is inherently evil and are creating problems for us that can never be fixed? You can never change the fact that people gravitate towards their own. We like to be around people with a shared history and a shared culture and a shared understanding. That doesn't mean that we don't like to be around people where we don't have that shared understanding. You know, I left South Africa when I was 17 years old to go and live in Paris and see the world. And I never went back to live except for a brief period in college, you know? And so I've spent my whole life sharing and experiencing and learning and understanding other cultures. My house is an open door. My kids know, you know, everything from Afghan culture to Iraqi culture to African cultures, you know, and so I have a great love of that. But when you look at the world and you look at history, that's a natural human instinct. In Little Italy, the Italians gathered together, the Irish gathered together, right? You have communities. And so if you make the human instinct, those human instincts to be inherent evil, you're creating a problem that can never, ever be fixed. And it's just like the pandemic. There's so many, when you talk to oncologists, especially ones who deal with bone marrow, who identify coronaviruses every single day because they have to, that's how they keep their patients alive. They will tell you there are hundreds of coronaviruses out there. And if there aren't coronaviruses, there are other viruses. So, you know, you've now created something where we're no longer responsible for our own health and well-being. We're responsible for everyone else on the planet. Come on, America, do it with me, right? You know, we can't do it alone. You've all got to do it together. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Well, I mean, that is creating another problem that can never, ever be fixed, because anytime you want, there's going to be another public health crisis. Now they're talking about possible 2-year lockdowns for the climate crisis. I mean, there's no, you know, now if you don't recycle, are you murdering your neighbor because you're taking away life from the planet? And now this is a part of our collective responsibility as human beings, moving away from individual responsibility to a collective responsibility for an endless amount of problems that can never, ever, ever be solved, but can always be used to justify taking away our God-given rights and the principles by which we have chosen to live.
I love that you say God-given rights, because one of the things that bothers me is there's all these discussions of rights people want to pull back as if they were granted by the government. And I think people need to get back to the understanding, and this goes back to education and how we teach civics to kids, the understanding that our rights are granted by God. Our Constitution simply acknowledges those rights. And so the protection of those rights is the protection of something that was inherently ours to begin with when we were born. The country didn't grant them. Other countries that do not recognize those rights are tyrannical governments, you know, and that needs to be something that more kids are educated on. And that's why, you know, with the worry about, you know, dividing people further, I'd say, you know, I mean, I'm worried about that too. But at the end of the day, what we have now is essentially a system that says, hey, you know, they kind of count on our fallback of always wanting to deal with things in a nice way. And I think that's something that has hurt us in the long run. And is part of how we got to this point is for too long, we just sort of went along to get along. And doing that has not served us well. And I think at a certain point, we have to challenge them by saying, look, you're going to take it this far, then we're going to offer alternatives to people who think like us, and you're going to have to compete with us. And I think that form of competition is what can bring us back to a place where we're not so divided, because if they have to compete and they realize, whoa, this woke culture and critical race theory and all this stuff is pushing people out of public education, we need to dial that back, or we're going to keep losing our tax dollars that we're funded with. You know, because you look at a school district like in Baltimore, $17,000 something per child that they spend in public schools there. And they have high schools where less than 10% of the kids are literate when they are in their senior year of high school.
Outrageous.
It's outrageous. There's no reason for it. And again, I think honestly, you made some really great points about term limits, because term limits is part of how we got here. Not having those term limits, rather.
Yeah.
Because these people, they're beholden to different interests, and it builds and builds. And you know this better than anybody from your work as a journalist. You know how deep these ties run. These people, they are best friends with lobbyists, and they're best friends with these people. They become a DC monopoly, essentially. They're a lot like Amazon, but in human form, you know? And they're so beholden.
Are they human? I'm not sure.
I mean, sometimes it doesn't feel like it, but they're so beholden to their friends in DC that we get the same corruption over and over again. And, you know, that's part of why I decided to run for Congress. My family escaped socialism, and I don't want to see us fall into that by virtue of the fact that we have this small bubble of elites in DC who are beholden to special interests, who are all veering towards that woke leftism. And the person I'm running against has been, this is his 16th term that he's in. Nobody should be in Congress for over 30 years. Nobody. And
well, you know,
they make
the
the same
point that
decisions over and over again.
The point that you make there, Robbie, is also a very valid one, that in order to fight for the principles that you believe in, you do also have to protect them. And so having your own schools and removing yourselves from systems that are destroying, I mean, absolutely obliterating those values and those rights, that is a necessary part of the fight as well. So even though I say, you know, I don't want to see things further divided, as long as they are really open, right? As long as you're not creating a walled off system, there is a real valid, strong argument for saying you do have to create things to protect what you're fighting for. Because if it's gone, how can you fight for it, right? And if you're just all scattered across someone else's system, then you're not going to be able to fight. And you know, when you say it's not just enough for us to go along with it anymore, because look what it's cost. I think the principle behind what you're talking about is that this country has existed in a certain form for a very long time. And people like yourselves and like me were happy with that, with the way it was, not with everything, but we believed in what it was fundamentally. And so when people believe in something and they think that it's on solid ground, it's protected, it's been around a long time, it's been stable, there's checks and balances built into the system, we have real institutions that do their job, that live up to their legal charter and protect those things that we all hold dear. And we're all, you know, it's not easy to live in that environment. So many of us have one job or two jobs or three jobs or very demanding jobs. We're trying to look after kids. And so we don't pay attention. And when you want to change all of that, when you want to take all of that and make it something completely and utterly different, you have a very different mindset. Number one, you need to infiltrate. And if you look at what communists and Marxists and historically what the left has done all over the world, they infiltrate institutions. So that's why you have local councils and school districts in majority Republican areas or conservative areas where the people in power and in control who are making decisions are all on the left. Or radicals or progressives. So it's not just that we've said, okay, we don't want to be nasty. We don't want to, okay, you want your wokeism or whatever. We're not going to offend anyone. We'll go along with it. It's also that while we've been living and content and working hard and whatever else, we've not been paying attention because institutions all the way down to school, I think it was in 2015 that George Soros said he was going to take over the judicial system.
Yep.
What did we do about that? What did
we
reporters
did nothing.
and journalists do? Nothing. And so now you wonder when people are trying to get, allegations of vote fraud heard in court, and they can't get a single judge to even let the evidence be heard. You're wondering how that happens. And why that happens? Well, because you let it happen on your watch, and you didn't participate in the schools, and you didn't participate in the local law enforcement sheriff's elections, and you ignored the fact that the ACLU has moved lawyers into, cities and towns all across this country, and has been running negative ads against anyone who doesn't fit with their political agenda. And you've ignored the fact that when people get targeted, when Tucker Carlson is targeted, for example, why aren't there 50 companies lining up to say, you don't want to advertise on his show, we'll advertise? When people on the right get targeted, why aren't there foundations that help them with legal support or that provide security at their homes? I've had death threats from Antifa. I can't afford to have security at my home. What protection do I have? I can't afford to fight people in court, and how many people are there like me? Tons and tons and tons of them. So I agree with you that I think it is important and it is valid to create mechanisms to protect what it is that you believe in and what you're fighting for. In fact, it's critical. And I would also add to that we are in uncharted waters. It has never been under threat today the way that it is under threat now, because the knowledge and power that the big tech companies and government, because there's back doors into all of this technology, right? And the NSA is collecting on everybody and storing that content, because they have unrivaled ability to control human beings now than they ever have. It is, it's absolutely, it's life and death, actually. It's life and death.
And I think people, to your point, they're getting too focused in on the big fish. So say the presidential election. I always tell people all politics are local. And you mentioned those Republican counties where they're being run by people who are not Republican. I tell people this all the time with the education issue. If you're concerned about it, go look at your school board and see what's the ideology of the people who make up your school board, and why didn't anybody with your ideology run against them? And too often it's because people, like you said, they have their head down and they're working hard and they're not looking at what's going on around them. And Marxists and people that are aligned ideologically with them, they're planners, they're plotters, they infiltrate, and they do it very carefully and methodically. That's why we're at a point where I don't believe we have the time to go do the reverse and infiltrate and get back to a middle of sorts. I think that we're at a point in time where the quickest route to sanity is us creating our own. We need our own systems, our own institutions. We need, places that will go and sue, or will get security for, independent journalists. We need all of those things. We need our own Hollywood.
An independent internet.
We need absolutely. And I've been actually pushing Elon Musk for that, and for him to create technology that is independent from the system, like new cell phones and things along those lines, because we're beholden to these small group of companies who are inherently evil. And there's no way around that. We can't keep tiptoeing around it and pretending they're not what they are. They're inherently evil institutions that treat us all like we're a stream of data and not like human beings. When we get to that point in time, it's no wonder that we have a generation of young kids who are, starting to veer towards the idea of socialism, because we've lost our humanity. And what is more sort of understandable to people who've lost their humanity than socialism? You can sell a dream to them, and you can also detach them from reality. And that's where we're at. We've allowed that to happen. And this is the moment for good people to stand up and to say, we're not gonna allow this to happen to our country, because we've seen what happens historically, and what happens is a really, 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 really dark future, and we don't want to see that happen. So I think it's a critical point for people to latch on to creating new things and to be unafraid and be bold. It's a time to be bold. There's times in history where you have to take risks and know that things are going to happen. I did it myself. We set our careers on fire in Hollywood. I worked with all Oscar-winning actors and Oscar-winning actresses, directing them, and biggest music stars in the world. And I on fire because our future matters more than my individual career. It matters more than my individual experience as a human being. And it's worth fighting for, and I think that's something that people have lost sight of. I do want to jump back to something you mentioned. You mentioned that we're living in a world without borders because of technology. I wanted to bring up our actual borders. So you have so much experience on the ground in crises all over the world. What you see happening now, there's two flashpoints I want you to sort of comment on. And one is the media bias between this happening when Trump was president versus now, because it went from being everyone involved is evil in the government in the Trump administration to Biden's facing a challenge as if it just poof out of thin air, you know, it just appeared. There's a new challenge and we're ready to tackle the challenge. And that's the thing about something else you said, how they work, linguistics. Linguistics matter so much. And using a word like challenge evokes a sense of they can overcome a challenge. Whereas the framing with Trump that this is about skin color, it evokes division and hate and anger.
Concentration camp.
And concentration camp. All those words, kids in cages. I swear to you, I really saw this in an article this week, and I want to say it was Reuters. They referred to the place where the kids are as soft-sided enclosures. Soft-sided enclosures. So we went from cages to soft-sided enclosures.
And they're the exact same buildings. They are literally the exact same buildings.
Literally the same.
I'm one of the few journalists that went around one of the processing facilities during the 2019 border crisis under Trump. And I can tell you that there were televisions and there were tables full of snacks. There was a play area for the kids. There were 24-hour caregivers. I mean, they had young girls who were there during the day. They had certain shifts, and then they had Border Patrol agents who would take the night shift, who were looking after these unaccompanied children. There was a laundromat there where they had a contractor who was doing everybody's laundry. There were rows of brand new socks, rows of brand new shirts, brand new underwear, brand new clothing. I mean, there was everything that all of the basic needs that you could provide for in order to facilitate what is, an unpleasant situation for anyone. Nobody wants to see women and children or families or anyone in confinement, right? For lack of a better term here. But at the end of the day, whether it's in their best interest or in the country's best interest, or you're enforcing the law or all of those things, if you come into any country illegally and there is some kind of process, you're going to be held. And that's what I came to realize, is that no matter how inhumane or humane you say that one person's policies are, when you put a limit to how many people can cross that border, there are going to be people who are going to try to come past that limit. And when they do, they're going to have a difficult journey. Some of them are going to die. And there is going to be a point at which some people who deserve to be here, who have terrible stories and who've suffered terribly, are not going to be able to get in. And that's a reality unless you believe in an open border. And look at the situation where we are now, where this administration has effectively bypassed the legal immigration system and opened up the border. And they're not saying that it's an open border, but let me tell you, don't be fooled by all the, oh my gosh, the Biden administration had no idea this was going to happen and they've been taken by surprise. Let me tell you, I was talking to agents, and in week 1 of this administration, they were told, prepare for a migrant crisis. Reopen all of the facilities that have been closed since 2019, once the Trump administration instituted policies that deterred people from coming and prevented people from coming. They started rebuilding the facility in Donna, Texas. When I was down at the border in late last year in December, they were already rebuilding some of these facilities. And they were told that agents would be taken off security patrols, that the focus was on migrant care, that they needed to get people out of these processing centers as quickly as possible. And they were told to prepare for massive, massive, massive numbers. So they knew all along that this was coming. And what is more important, to me, one of the most significant questions that's not being asked is, why are they willing to allow this, and why do they want this? Because it's, when you allow them to just spin it and say, well, this is a more humane policy, right? I mean, this is, there's so much wrong with allowing politicians to just bury the border in migrant care and immigration issues. And what we're not addressing as a result of that is the fact that no administration is really doing anything about the real security threats on the border. Trump and Bill Barr told me this personally, they both wanted to designate the cartels as terrorist organizations. And that is one possible solution to this. What I can tell you that I know for sure is that in spite of the best efforts of some of the most committed and truly brave, decent law enforcement agents for decades who have given everything and done significant things, that model of relying on U.S. law enforcement is not going to deal with the security threat that is posed by cartels who are literally a parallel shadow government in Mexico today. The Mexican government takes its orders from the cartels, and U.S. law enforcement's jurisdiction ends at the U.S. border. When they go into Mexico, they go with the permission of the Mexican government. And the cartels, since they're giving the orders, they're not given orders of cooperation. They've had the Mexican government double down on their sovereignty and remove immunity from prosecution for U.S. agents. That happened late last year. They also have stopped Mexican law enforcement from cooperating with U.S. law enforcement openly. Everything has to now go through a fusion cell in the Foreign Office and has to be reported in writing by Mexican Marines and soldiers and law enforcement. Otherwise, they can be charged with treason. So what they're doing is they're stopping cooperation, which means that your law enforcement model is even, is really shutting down. And at the same time, the cartels have become, they've militarized. They're trained by special operations units. They have more money than anyone on the planet. They have 50 caliber machine guns. I was listening to cartel fighting today, and I heard miniguns. Those are the Gatling guns that they have. They've got 5th generation armored vehicles, and they have no limits. There's no limits to what they can do. They're not bound by any conventions or any kind of rules of war or anything like that. And on top of everything else, they've made strategic partnerships with U.S. adversaries and enemies, from terrorist groups like Hezbollah and others, Hamas, and also with countries like China. The Chinese Communist Party and is now, has a history of using drug warfare. There are two Chinese colonels who have written about this. And what the Chinese know is that when people are doing drugs in the United States, they're not joining the army because they can't. They'll get tested and they won't be able to join. And when you've got people dying from overdoses, they're not paying taxes. They're not functioning members of society. These days with Narcan to reverse fentanyl opioid overdoses, they're coming back from death, but not all of them are coming back with full brain function. So you're literally creating generations of people who are mentally disabled. And, one of the estimates in 2016 was that when there were around 60,000 overdose deaths in this country, I think the cost to the U.S. economy was $500 or $600 billion. Now you have over 80,000. And I can tell you this, right now today, the DEA is stopping millions of counterfeit pills at the southern border every single day. And when they're testing them in the labs, they're laced with enough fentanyl to kill you. One pill to kill you. And fentanyl was introduced to the U.S. street by the Chinese. That drug came from China as a street drug. And they have taught the Mexican cartels how to make it in labs in Mexico with the chemical precursors. DEA has found Chinese chemists on the ground in places like Sinaloa training Mexican pharmacists in how to make this. And they are infiltrating it all over the country. They have thousands of cartel members that are present in the US that are buying up land, buying up property, laundering their money. The Chinese are laundering the money for them. And they've become an important partner on the money side of it as well. And they also use counterfeit Chinese goods as a form of money laundering. Plus, in the opioid crisis, prescription pills, access to those are way, 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 way down. So what are people doing now? They're buying fake pills. And the Chinese are sending the pill presses and the color dyes, all the, the material comes from the kings of counterfeit to their Mexican partners, and they're infiltrating it into the US. And it's so cheap that they're able to give it away free and create demand in places that there has never been demand. And they're mixing it into every other drug. So there's no doing, straight heroin these days. The DEA informants that they have on the street, people they have working with them, they can't find pure heroin. They're struggling to even find it because it's mixed in. So you don't even know necessarily that you're taking fentanyl. And that's why meth overdoses are up 35%, because it's mixed in with fentanyl. And so the US has never seen a drug crisis like it has right now. There's never been the quantity of narcotics with that level of potency that, by the way, can be engineered to be more and more and more potent in the labs in Mexico that are both in rural areas and in cities. These are also uncharted waters. And to think that the Chinese are not strategic about this and don't know exactly what they're doing is to be completely foolish. And by the way, you don't protect your country by hoping for the best. You protect your country by planning for the worst. And no administration has been doing that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I wanted to talk to you and ask you about, the human trafficking at the border. There's not been a journalist that's covered this more extensively and comprehensively than you. When I, in my work, in my activism on behalf of human trafficking victims, talking to them about the border, there's such a disconnect with all the propaganda and all the linguistic manipulation with the cages. What can you tell people about what is actually happening from you being there yourself? We know that thousands of unaccompanied minors, unprecedented rates are coming here. And, the other question I wanted to get in was, who is incentivizing these migrant caravans, like Pueblos Sin Fronteras and George Soros funded, NGOs coming over here. Can you broaden, that explanation to encompass that picture for us?
So I'm actually really glad that you raised the trafficking part of this, because it's probably the greatest failing of us as a society today that we are sitting here looking at the largest form of human slavery, modern human slavery in existence. And it's right over the southern border, and it's all across this country. And it's not just children coming from other countries, it's American children as well. And there's a lot of effort. The only time that I've ever heard NGOs play down sexual violence is when you talk about what happens to the women and children who are raped on their way to the United States. Absolutely. Or the children who are trafficked. It's really quite extraordinary. And whether people are being trafficked for labor, which is a lot of people who are coming over, who are paying part of their smuggling fees and maybe not paying all of it. They come with cards in their pockets with bank account numbers. So when they're working their 2-3 jobs, when you're going to a restaurant in New York and people are working in the kitchens and serving you, know that very often a significant part of what they're earning is being sent back to the cartels. And what the cartels are now doing, human smuggling and trafficking has become so lucrative that this was a business that was run by smuggling networks, which they took a cut from, right? They controlled how it operated because they control the terrain, but they were willing to let the human smuggling networks really kind of run it. Now they're in control. Right? They're fully in charge because it's worth so much money. And that doesn't just mean deciding who crosses, when they cross, why they cross, where they cross. I mean, there's a trickle of water in El Paso. Everybody would cross there if it was up to them. No one would risk going through the mountains in Arizona or drowning in the Rio Grande if they could choose. So they're not in control. And the other part of this is that they're making so much money out of this that it enables all of the other things that they do. So when you see women dying in just extraordinary numbers across Mexico in the most terrible, terrible way, and children and innocent fathers and sons and brothers as well, know that every time you turn around and you ignore this, you are aiding and abetting some of the most evil people on earth who have literally no mercy, who will cut out the heart of a 14-year-old boy and eat it in front of him while they pump his body full of heroin to keep him from going into shock and dying, to make sure that he experiences that horror before he dies. And that's just one example of legions that I can give you, which I won't torture you with. And then let's talk about the girls. So I went into a town in Mexico called Tenancingo, which is north of Mexico City. And it's built on generations of sex trafficking, literally generations. That is the core identifying business. It is the thriving engine, the economic engine, the social, cultural engine of the town. And I was lucky enough that I had great people in Mexico I was working with who were able to get one of the pimps in one of the families from Tenancingo to come to a neighboring town with 2 of the girls that they had bought and that worked for them. I mean, I say worked, I shouldn't, because work in that situation is to be raped over and over again, 7 days a week, 24/7, for as long as you're there. One of the girls was 12 when she was bought from her family in Chihuahua. The other girl was 17. She was now 25, and the other girl was, I think, like 22. So this was one of the most difficult interviews I have ever done, because I didn't really realize until that moment that every time I'd interviewed women before who'd been like Yazidi women who had been held and raped and terrorized by ISIS, or Serbian women who had been raped in the Kosovan War, right? I mean, sorry, Kosovan women who'd been raped by Serbs in the Kosovan War. Every time I did those kind of interviews, these women were free of that. They had escaped, or they'd been brought out, and it was over. Now it was up to them, you know, to see if they could rebuild their lives and piece themselves together again and overcome that what they'd been through. But when I was with those two girls, I had to look into their eyes and know that they were going to get up at the end of that afternoon and they were going to go right back there and be raped that night again, over and over. And so it was horrible. It was really horrible because, you know, here you are in a hotel, because where else are we going to go? And you're offering them something to drink and eat, and you're taking them for 5 moments, 5 seconds away from this hell, and then you're sending them back. What kind of person would do that? What kind of person would let them go back into that? And you know, one of the hardest moments for me as a mother was both girls had been betrayed in their words by their mothers, because their mothers were the people they were the closest to. And the day that the people came to buy them and take them away, it was their mother that had broken the news to them and told them, you know, to be a good girl and to pack a bag and to do this for the family, and, you know, and put that on them. And yet when I asked both of them, what would you do if you were free? If you could do anything or go anywhere in the world, what would it be? And both of them said they would find their mother. And the one girl said, but I don't know if she would have me because of what I've done. And that was, boy, I wanted to cut my heart out and just leave it there, because there was nothing that I could do. And I would say to you that these women often have children, and their children are often used for snuff videos and child porn. And I asked one of the Mexican investigators about that. And we'd been together for a while at that point. It was the two of us late at night, and he was off the record, you know, and more comfortable with me. And he was telling me some of the more torturous details that he wouldn't otherwise have said. And one of the things he said to me was, I said, you know, in these videos, are they violent with these children? Because I can't bear to think of that, right? And I'm hoping that he's going to say no. And he says, oh, yes, they're violent, very violent. He said, especially with the boys, not so much with the girls, but especially with the boys. And I have a son, and my son is the gentlest, sweetest person in our house. And so I said to him, and how old are they usually, you know? And he said, from what you've seen, and he said, mostly around 5 years old. So to be raped and violently abused and often killed for someone else's pleasure. And people will look at the overall number of the statistics of people coming over the border, and the argument that they will make against, you know, any kind of intervention like DNA testing, or, you know, being detained long enough to be interviewed by Border Patrol to try and ascertain whether the person with you is really your parent. Do you know where you're going? Do you have a real job if you think that if you've been told that you're going to a job, right? Do you know the people that are going to you? Well, the people who argue against that say, well, the number of people being trafficked is tiny. It's a small percentage. The vast majority of people coming over are, you know, families seeking a better life. Well, when you're looking at, so there's more than 27,000 unaccompanied minors have come across the border in the first 5 months of this year. And that is on a par with the total number who came across the border in the last fiscal year. Before you factor in the hot weather, when the numbers across the board of people coming over the border are going to soar, right? Immigration patterns in this country show that every year, come April, the numbers start going through the roof. So even without that, we're on track to have at least 100,000 unaccompanied minors in this country just this fiscal year. What does 10% of that represent if 10% are being trafficked? What does 5% represent? What does 1% represent? I mean, would you be comfortable knowing that 10 children a day are being raped and murdered and tortured?
Yeah, what is their number? What's the number?
What's the number?
It doesn't matter.
That's what we always
ask that. What is the number where it's okay?
Yep. What's the number of MS-13 or other gang members that are coming over? That's okay. Follow the Laredo statistics, because Laredo, Texas is a big port of entry, and it's mostly males that cross there, not families. And you will see how often they're apprehending people with a history, with a criminal record of murder or rape or aggravated assault or child abuse with a minor or child abuse with a minor under the age of 5. I mean, the cartels know what they're doing. They exploit the movement of people across the southern border. They exploit the legal loopholes, and and you know that. You know how you know that? Because at the same time that the numbers of unaccompanied minors crossing has soared, so has what? Fentanyl seizures. In fact, fentanyl now, in the first 5 months of this fiscal year, has just surpassed the entire amount of fentanyl that was seized at the southern border in the whole of the last fiscal year, which was a record number at that time. So we're on track to go way beyond that this year. And the last thing I will say is, you asked about who's funding this. Well, that's a difficult question to answer with certainty, because the people who are funding it are so powerful that every time you try to get close, you're either branded as a conspiracy theorist, or you're completely and utterly obliterated in the attacks that they're able to marshal, because they have information dominance. They have political operatives throughout the media. We still go into battle every day and ask the enemy, what are the terms they want us to fight on? What do I mean by that? Because we say the New York Times and all people across the media are using different language, and they're hypocritical. And we've got 40 million examples, as I like to say. The battlefield of information warfare at this point is littered with the corpses of hypocrisy and double standards, right? We all know that. And yet, what do? We still go to the New York Times to see what it is that they're reporting. We still cite them as a paper of record. We still look to them to set the terms of who's credible and who's not credible. And we do it to ourselves.
Divorce the system. That's where we're at. If there's one message I hope people can get from this, is divorce these systems.
Or what about this, Robbie? What about this? What about buy the New York Times, buy CBS News? Don't, creating new
I would
systems.
love for our billionaires to do that.
Well, they've got the money. Why haven't they? That's on them.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
That's on them.
One of the more infuriating points to me is that I've seen some people spending money on things like that are political dinosaur age, for lack of a better term, in terms of what they find to be important, when they could be making major cultural change happen with their money. And that's something that's just infuriating. But for a normal person, I feel like the best thing we can do is divorce that and support people who are telling you the truth without regard for party. Like you said earlier, truth tellers, people like you, people like us that are going to always fight for the truth no matter what. Because guess what? If a Republican institutes policies that are going to allow human trafficking to thrive, I'm going to oppose them at every turn. It just so happens that right now, this administration is helping cartels to traffic little girls. They're helping cartels to bring drugs across the border that are killing our children. I just saw a story that you retweeted.
Right? Yeah. They've just amplified that ability. It's gone through the roof. So now it's many more children who are going to die and suffer.
Yep. Absolutely. And I just saw a story that you put out about that young man at the gym who was given fentanyl, and he didn't know it was fentanyl. He thought it was just a normal, lower grade painkiller, and they gave him fentanyl and he died. This is happening.
Same with kids taking Adderall to stay up and study, or taking Xanax because they're, anxious about school. And what wouldn't make you anxious these days? Because you're told to be anxious about everything. And they have no idea that what they're taking could be baby powder or baby formula with fentanyl. And these are the fake pills that I was talking about. And you can get a hot pill. One DEA agent, Sherry Oz in Phoenix, Arizona, she told me about a friend of hers who's the police captain, whose daughter grew up around a counter narcotics cop his whole life. And she went to a party with 3 friends, 4 girls. They each took 1 pill, and it was 4 hot pills, and all 4 of them died. That was it, like that, gone.
Horrific.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
We could talk to you for like another 4 hours.
We don't want to be too long. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll continue to support your amazing work. There's very few journalists left, quite honestly. So thank you so much for being a light.
I just want to say thank you for doing your job the way you do, because there's so few people who just they fight for the truth unashamedly and with vigor like you do. It's just, you do an incredible job, and we're all better for it. So I really appreciate you doing that and coming on with us.
Well, you are both doing the same thing, and I want to say thank you to you, because it really does give me strength. Nobody can do it alone, and I am not unique. We share the same DNA when you're willing to do this, right? Because it does cost you. I mean, that's the reality. The world you're talking about is a world of outliers. This is not the Super Bowl. This is not Hollywood. This is not the Nobel Prize. Our entire society, everything about it, awards and recognition and credibility, is built around this Super Bowl, where none of us are invited, because the only condition for entry is that you think like us, and you behave like us, and you toe the line like us, and you take a knee, and you surrender, and you blind yourself to what's coming, and you enslave yourself on our orders, and you don't fight back. And what they want is to crush the human spirit. They want us to see each other along party lines and along racial lines. They want us to forget that we are united. They want us to think that we've lost before we've even begun to fight, because that's the reality here, right? We're not even in the fight. That's the truth. And the one thing I will say, you mentioned God-given rights versus human rights. And when you mention that in the context of the border, it is very, very prescient and relevant, because what you're seeing with migration today is politicians all over the world talk about the human right to migrate. And we are seeing across the board human rights, which are granted by governments, replacing God-given rights, or being equated as God-given rights, on the pathway to eradicating Christian religion as we know it, and replacing it with the religion of climate science and climate change, which is, by the way, an actual religion. And where spirituality now comes just from the planet. And through all of these things, you see what? Climate being used to justify an assault on agriculture and a war on beef, where we're told to be natural and organic, except no, wait, rather eat this protein that I've made in a laboratory than eat the natural stuff, because in all cases, what's natural and organic is good for you, except when I want you to do this. And by the way, we're getting to zero emissions. Why is nobody asking what that means for air travel? Because as far as I'm aware, there's no fuel or power source that's been created today yet that can even come close to powering jet engines. So does that mean we're not going to travel? Oh, you're right. We're not going to travel. But guess what? They are, right? They're still going to have it. So as we become more geographically isolated and controlled through a centralized control of the food supply, and we're told now you've got to eat this, you can't eat that, we're not allowed to worship, we're not allowed to go to church, we're not allowed to practice religion because it's harmful. Our religion is now harmful, right? Because it doesn't recognize 14 million genders necessarily. And so as all of these things are eradicated, we have to pay attention to it all. We can't look in isolation at education or, the border or what's happening with the food supply, because no one goes to war and wins if they only fight on one front. You have to fight on all fronts, and that's what they're doing. And I would say, I'll leave you with this. Here's one great example of where we're not paying attention. House Resolution 127 has passed in the House. Do you know what that was? What that bill says? What it was about?
That's the Sheila Jackson's bill, right?
Sheila Jackson Lee, from
Yeah.
a Democratic congresswoman from Texas, is the person who tabled this legislation.
Yeah. It's trying to
and it is,
take your gun rights entirely.
Oh, well, it's very interesting because it's not abolishing the Second Amendment. This is a very smart, sophisticated strategy, because rather than attack the Second Amendment and take away the Second Amendment, what they've done is leave the Second Amendment in place for all of their people, and enacted legislation that enables them to take legislation away from anyone they want to take it from. Why do I say that? Because not only do you have to have, everyone has to apply for a license. You have to have a license for every single weapon. You have to do a training course that most people will not be able to afford. That has to be by an approved facility, a certain number of hours, et cetera, et cetera. But most significantly, you have to get insurance for every weapon, which is $800 a year. That's what it's starting at. $800 a year. And, out in the countryside, people often have, more than one
20
weapon.
guns, 50.
Yep, yep. And that insurance is given to you by the Attorney General of your state, who you're paying for the insurance, by the way, who also gets to decide which psychologists are allowed to do your psychological evaluation, and also gets to set the standards under which you are to be evaluated. And guess who need not apply, because you're automatically out of the running? Anyone who's been diagnosed with PTSD or has had any issues with substance abuse, whether it's alcohol or narcotics, or is deemed psychologically unsuitable to have a weapon by the psychologist.
Which will very quickly become conservative.
No, it already is.
Conservative will be psychologically unstable.
And 2 members of your household have to be interviewed by the psychologist. If they don't have 2 members there, they can go into your workplace. They can go into your friends. They are required to interview all of your former spouses, so ex-husbands and ex-wives. They have to be interviewed as well. And it goes on and on and on. If there's ever been a domestic disturbance at call to your home, if the neighbors have complained of disturbances, if you just go through that bill and see when you go down through it, what the power that it gives them. And that's just to have an ordinary license. Now, if you want to apply for a license for a military style weapon, which the definition of which has been expanded to include almost everything under the sun, you now have to be an existing license holder, and now you have to apply for this other license on top of that. So they've created a process that will turn millions of law-abiding Americans into criminals overnight. You also have to report your ammunition. You have to report where the gun is being kept. So if it's not in that place when somebody comes to search your home. And by the way, at the same time, go and look at what the American Pediatric Association is doing in the forms that you're given when you go to your doctor's wellness visit for your kids. And you will see on there, it says, do you have guns in your home? Do you feel safe in your home? Do your parents have tension in their marriage? Is there violence in the way they fight? I mean, they've literally created systems. And by the way, on there, it also asks my 11-year-old child if he's having sex with other boys. And if he's having group sex with boys and girls, right? Questions like this. And the kids are told to answer those questions without their parent around. And you're given the same forms, which you have to answer, so they can compare your answers and figure out, what they think the truth is. So that's why I say you can't fight on one front. You have to be aware that these things, it's not just in the education system, it's infiltrated into the medical system as well, into academia, into, as we know, into Hollywood, into social media, and take a look at what is going to be coming up with YouTube, because you will see in the research that's being done that YouTube is actually the most powerful influencer of all when it comes to our children.
And silence is killing us. If you're in any one of these industries now, there's no turning back. You have to stand up and stand for something. So when they're trying to push this stuff through, you have to be the voice that's bold enough to say, hey, you know what? No. And maybe that'll inspire some other people to be bold too. And even if it doesn't, in 20 years, you're going to be able to sleep at night because you did the right thing. But, what you said there is just, it's incredible, because if you said this 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, people would have thought you were insane.
1 year ago.
It,
1 year
honestly,
ago,
even
Robin.
1 year ago, even 1 year ago, they would have thought that you were insane. So we need to act with the same sort of intensity that they've acted to get to this point. And we need to reject
don't
it
let the
just as
cancel
intensely.
culture win. Don't let them, I mean, we all do it. I do it as well. You know, oh my gosh, if I talk about this or I talk about that, am I going to be, branded as a conspiracy theorist? Is my career going to be destroyed forever? Is that the last vestige of my credibility out the window? You know, we just can't bow to that. Buy my pillows. Let Mike Lindell say whatever he wants to say. You know, why can't you watch Plandemic? Why can't you see what Dr. Judy Mikovits has to say? If it's not true, people will figure it out. And,
Exactly.
you know, if vaccines do no harm, people will figure that out, right?
Exactly.
And if they do harm, and that's why they're paying out millions of dollars to victims of, families who've been affected by vaccines every year, well, then people will figure that out. But but the world that we've got into, where we're afraid now of doing anything, where you read Andy Ngo's book on Antifa, which is a great book, by the way, written by an extraordinary journalist that I encourage everybody to go out there and read. In fact, buy 10 copies just because they don't want you to read it. That should be enough reason alone for you to want to see what it is that they want to suppress. And I'm going to steal from a journalist called Gary Webb for my closing line. I'm not someone that's very good at quoting people very often, but this is a quote that stayed with me, because Gary Webb is the journalist from the San Jose Mercury who broke the story of Dark Alliance, of the CIA basically being responsible for bringing crack cocaine onto America's streets and into Black neighborhoods. And he won the Pulitzer when this originally was published, and he was hailed as a hero of the journalistic community. And then the CIA started doing what they do still today so very well. And of course, our media colleagues jumped in there, only too happy to oblige. And they began to slowly break apart Gary Webb and his story until he was utterly obliterated and destroyed. And before he died, committed suicide by shooting himself, not once, but twice in the head, I will just say, perhaps his crowning achievement, considering, what that is really like in real life. But he wrote in his book that he had been going along and he'd been judging journalism contests, and he'd been going to colleges and speaking about journalism, and he'd been winning awards and, living the good life. And he says, and then I wrote Dark Alliance, and I realized how sadly misplaced my bliss had been, that it wasn't because I was so meticulous and so careful and so good at my job. It was just that I'd never written anything important enough to suppress.
That's wonderful. Wow. And I'll say this, in the future, we're going to reach a point where if they have not tried to cancel you, it's going to make me suspicious of people. And
they're trying. I get death threats from Antifa mailed to my home. And, I'll tell you what the narrative is, so that, they tried to say that my husband is this evil, dark, shadowy force that has tainted all my work because he was working for the U.S. military as some kind of security contractor, which is absolutely not true, and it's never stuck because it's a lie. And then they try to say that I once was a great journalist at 60 Minutes, but now I've gone crazy. And that I'm not at 60 Minutes because of my Benghazi story. I was sloppy and I didn't do my job. And of course, it's not because I signed a non-disclosure agreement with the publishers. My team did. And all of the things that they cited us for as not doing our jobs were covered by the NDA, which they left out of the review. And it's got nothing to do with politics. And it's got nothing to do that they didn't want anyone to see that story, because it was important enough to suppress.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. And for all the viewers, please, if you can, reach out to your representatives about Sheila Jackson Lee's bill. One of the best messaging points you can use is use their arguments against them. This is a racist bill. It is essentially making gun rights only available for the wealthy, which is going to predominantly hurt Black and Latino communities more so than other races. It is a racist bill, and not only is it racist, it's unconstitutional. So, but
it is definitely unconstitutional.
It's 100% unconstitutional. So please reach out to your representatives about fighting this bill. It's essential that we have enough people rise up in the Senate to ensure that this has no chance of getting passed. Thank you so much, Laura, for joining
Lara.
us.
Thank you, both of you. And pay attention to human trafficking, trafficking of American kids, most of whom come out of the foster care system in this country. No oversight for the foster care system, no oversight for child protection services. And don't forget, they're getting all the money that's being taken from police departments.
That's
Why?
right.
That's
right.
You're amazing. Lynn covers that all the time, that issue with foster care and that system. We do a whole other episode on that because it's insane. But
so if I can help you with that, reach out to me because I would love to help you with that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Okay.
We'll
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Okay. Bye.